Welcome back to another one of my Elden Ring boss reviews. Today I'm talking about the Ulcerated Tree Spirit, who I fought and defeated in the Fringefolk hero's grave. And in my opinion, he is the first boss that I've reviewed that is legitimately great. And while there are some issues that hold it back from being an absolute classic, it scratches an itch that none of those other bosses were able to so far. But those issues keep it from scratching too hard, which might be a blessing in disguise, because otherwise, I might end up with ulcers covering my body just like this poor sap. Am I the only one who feels nauseated just looking at this guy? FromSoft has designed more grotesque bosses and bosses with more obviously painful ailments, but this one is the only one that makes me cringe. Those lesions all over him look like they're perpetually churning and burning, and he has to go through that eternal torture while looking like a tree version of the primordial serpents from Dark Souls, all while having the burn scars of Freddy Krueger. I mean, look at him. His true form looks like he has this hard tree bark exterior, but it's falling off of him where each of these 9,000 pus-filled pustules is gestating from. And his name kind of makes it clear that this is not an isolated ailment. He's not the tree spirit with an ulcer. He's not the tree spirit who is predisposed to developing ulcers. No, he's the ulcerated tree spirit. Like, that name implies that he's still developing these things, which is kind of awful considering how much of his body's real estate is already taken up by these ulcers. And it's a credit to FromSoft that they managed to elicit such a visceral reaction from me just by having the perfect marriage between this guy's visual design and his name. And let's spice that marriage up with a threesome. Let's bring in his fighting style for fun. There is absolutely no time to breathe during this fight. It's chaos pure and simple. He spends nearly the entire fight writhing furiously around the room. He never stops moving, and it's borderline the most sensory overload I've had during a FromSoft boss fight. It's almost too much, but it just works because I imagine this is exactly how I would act if I was in this much pain. Like, the first time I walked into his boss room 20 hours and 3 minutes into my playthrough, he immediately threw himself across the room and ate me within 13 seconds. And this happened to me like 3 or 4 more times after this. And I initially thought, wow, what a vicious attack. He spotted me and nailed me so fast. But now it feels more like the desperate and random movements of a creature who has been driven insane by pain. Like that first time that he ate me, I thought he was thinking something along the lines of, ooh, a tarnished. But now I realize it's more like, help me somebody, it burns! So I'm probably psychoanalyzing this tree/dragon/snake/centipede monstrosity a bit more than I probably should. But I'm just kind of trying to convey why I think this fight works despite some pretty egregious flaws. Like, outside of a few notable exceptions, almost all of his attacks seem random and like they have nothing to do with the player character. And when you actually look at the gameplay of this fight, it kind of shows that this is not so much a fight as much as it is avoiding being smushed to death by this guy. But that does lead me to my biggest problem with this fight, and that is the laughable collision detection. I mean, this boss clips through the walls the entire duration of the fight, and there is seemingly no rhyme or reason for what the game considers him hitting me. Like, sometimes avoiding damage in this fight does take timing and visual recognition on the part of the player. Like, his mouth grab, his tail swipe, and his AoE explosion are all telegraphed. But then other times you're just along for the ride, and it doesn't really feel like you have control over whether you should or shouldn't be taking damage. And while this is definitely a flaw, I feel like that chaos and randomness works well thematically for this fight. Plus, this is a boss that you still have to learn and figure out. You're not going to just march in there and lay waste to him. Like, I started with my normal flail, but eventually I realized I needed a weapon with better reach. And when I was just doing regular attacks with the great epee in hand, I wasn't doing enough damage before dying, so I switched to my special ability, the Impaling Thrust, which of course use up my magic meter and require me to allocate some magic flasks. And granted, this wasn't really about learning this guy's moves, this was more about learning how to survive this fight, but it still made this pretty freaking great. But even with all that praise, that shoddy hit detection is gonna keep this guy from getting a perfect score from me. But hold on, I went too far. We're not at the rating yet. Let's go back to the visual design because I only talked about the ulcers. There is so much more going on with him. For one, he's called the Tree Spirit, but he's more like an amalgamation of like 4 of the most terrifying things possible. He's like a cross between a dragon, a snake, a centipede, and a tree. And yes, I do mean that trees also terrify me. I have this weird and random and very specific phobia that I'll be lying in bed with my legs like off the bed's edge, and then a tree's just gonna fall through my house and land on my legs perfectly to snap my knees in half. Yeah, that terrifies me. But this is supposed to be a physical breakdown of his appearance, not my actual psychological breakdown. So let's stay on track. He's got branches coming out of his back and what looks like roots coming out of his chin, but he's also got multiple legs like a centipede. His movements are very snake-like, and both his fire breathing and his general head shape reminds me of a dragon. And did I mention that he is huge and that he absolutely fills this boss arena? I mentioned that I don't like how he clips through the walls too much, but I do feel like the designers at FromSoft probably thought about this and decided it's more important that this fight is claustrophobic than whether or not it obeys physics. And that's the right call. This fight would lose a lot of its impact if it was in a bigger arena. And speaking of the arena, I love when he takes you for a ride up to the top of the room and you get caught in the roots. It just looks like the roller coaster from hell. And shout out to the fact that you can actually hear what sounds like the ulcers pulsating before you enter the room. And speaking of the ulcers, I like that they aren't just purely physical wounds. There's actually this weird, ghostly, mist-like consistency to them. Leads me to believe that this is a magical curse. But what actually happened here? This is a hero's grave. Is this the corrupted spirit of that hero? Did the breaking of the Elden Ring cause this? Is this actually the spirit of the banished knight Olaf, whose ashes you receive for beating him? If so, what an awful fate. And yes, I realize now that I said Olaf instead of Oleg. And actually, reading this item description now, it mentions he got the hero's honor of Herb Tree Burial, which is kind of panic-inducing, because this most likely means there are more of these guys out there. But for now, let's rate this one. This is a 4 out of 5. Epic boss design, incredibly difficult. I died 13 times, with only 6 of those fights lasting longer than 25 seconds. I actually thought this was a late game boss because I kept getting destroyed so easily. But that feeling of perseverance and coming out on top, just spectacular. Only issue is a little bit of the randomness and the immense amount of clipping, but again, I think that kind of works with how this boss works thematically. And this one is always going to be memorable for me, just because of how close my last fight with him was. He knocked me down to a sliver of health, and I'd used up all of my mana flasks, so I couldn't do any of my impaling thrusts that I relied so heavily on. And I also had no more healing flasks left, so the final 30 seconds of this fight were so intense, and it made my eventual victory oh so sweet. Ranking him is easy. When looking at the boss I've beaten so far, he's far and away first. I mean, no other boss has swept me off my feet so easily. And hopefully I swept you off your feet with this review. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and leave me some comments. What'd you think of the Ulcerated Tree Spirit? Did you like him? Did you not like him? Did you die hundreds of times to him? Did you beat him on your first try? If you answered yes to that last question, then why are you lying to me? Nah, I'm just kidding. There's plenty of people who are so much better than me at this game. I'm sure someone beat him on their first try. It's just definitely wasn't me, because I got utterly wrecked. But he did not wreck me nearly as badly as the next boss I'm talking about. I'm going to be talking about Margit the Fell Omen. And that guy really, really, really was hard.